I'd like to apologize in advance for likely butchering a lot of pronunciations in this video. There are a lot of words and languages I don't speak, and there's only so much I can do repeating what Google Translate or one of those name pronunciation videos tell me 3 times like I'm trying to summon something. So yeah, sorry, I hope it's not too terrible. In 1933, in an attempt to mend a really strained relationship with the countries south of the border, President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States instilled the Good Neighbor policy. A policy essentially promising that the US would mind their own business and would aim to maintain peace and stability through cooperation and trade rather than military force. In his inaugural address in May 1933, Roosevelt stated, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others." I'm sure that aged well. Among these changes related to the Good Neighbor policy, there was an attempt to redefine the way particularly Latin Americans were represented in US media, and Roosevelt created the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, or OCIAA, in 1940 through the order of the US Council of National Defense, ironically. It was particularly to promote inter-American cooperation, also known as Pan-Americanism, but it was also done largely to combat the influence of the Axis powers in those countries. To achieve this, they also partnered with, for instance, Hollywood studios, making films incorporating Latin American culture and stars. The artists working on OCIAA content were appointed Goodwill Ambassadors. One of these so-called ambassadors was Walt Disney, which resulted in him and some Disney animators being sent to Latin America in 1941 by the US State Department in order to produce educational films about the USA's neighbors south of the border. Anyway, let's talk about some cartoon birds! If you're a fan of Disney ducks and birds, you may have heard of the Three Caballeros, a trio consisting of Donald Duck and his 2 friends, the parrot Jose Carioca from Brazil, and the rooster Panchito Pistoles from Mexico. The 3 have made a few appearances together through the years, both animated and in comics, and even had their own ride at Disney World. Panchito and Jose have also gained a bit of a following of their own since their first appearance. In this video, I'd like to take a closer look at this iconic trio, how they came to be, and what they've been used for over the years. Now, I'm not an expert, I've done some research, but I can't promise that everything I say is 100% accurate. There's some things I couldn't find that many sources for, and I think I'm lacking certain perspectives. You're welcome to correct me if you know something I say is a bit off. The story about how this trio came to be has a couple of odd things connected to it. To get to the bottom of it, we have to go back to a rather strange time in Disney history. In the early 1940s, Disney was not doing that well. Despite the good profits from former films, a lot of said profits were used to produce new ones. Walt Disney spent approximately $2.8 million in the production of Fantasia, which was economically speaking a bad call, since Fantasia was met with bad reviews and not nearly as much attention as films like Snow White. What didn't help at all was that there happened to be a war over in Europe, which made people a little too distracted to go watch Pinocchio. After laying off a bunch of animators as a reaction to this, the 800 remaining employees were dissatisfied and decided to start a strike. So suddenly, Walt Disney was caught up in labor union negotiations as well. Meanwhile, this surprise attack on Pearl Harbor happened, involving the US a lot more in the war they'd otherwise done their best not to get mixed up in. In late 1941, 500 United States Army troops thus started an occupation of Walt Disney Studios. Soon after the beginning of this 8-month occupation, the US services approached Walt Disney with a request to produce propaganda films for the government, promoting the war effort and educating soldiers. The government offered to pay significantly more than what Disney usually received for their production of various shorts, and because of the previously described financial problems, it was a pretty good deal for them. It led to some interesting shorts, to say the least. Overall, this isn't that relevant to what this video is actually about, but there are a couple of things here that are worth remembering for context. Primarily just that at this point in time, Disney was severely understaffed and very reliant on and closely connected to the US government. While the Three Caballeros' tale technically started a little bit before the occupation and even just on the verge of the labor strike, all of these events overlap pretty closely, and this era of Disney films had a very particular style to it for this reason. Because of the labor strike, the budget, and because a lot of the remaining animators were working on the propaganda cartoons later on, there weren't many employees left to work on other projects. This meant that they had to seek towards a slightly different format for their films. They created a series of animated package films where they, instead of making one consistent storyline, compiled a couple of different shorts into one feature-length film. Examples of later features of this sort are Make Mine Music and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This brings us back to the historical tangent at the beginning. The first of these package films came to be after Walt Disney and some Disney animators in collaboration with the US government went on a trip to Latin America. There was a request for Disney to produce some films with some South American atmosphere, but Disney Studios ended up going for something a little more intense than that. Somehow, the idea of a trip to Latin America came up. The offer was for Disney to produce a film that could be shown in the US, Central, and South America as a part of the Good Neighbor policy. The government guaranteed covering any debt obligations regardless of the film's reception. The occupation had yet to start at this point in time, but it was a very good deal considering their financial situation. Now, it may be worth mentioning that quote-unquote goodwill tours of this sort had at this time become common enough to be sort of notorious. There was a lot of ignorance among the goodwill ambassadors who didn't represent much of the culture they were trying to at all, and there was also an expectation for them to be entertained in Latin American countries in grand ways that there just wasn't a budget for. In fact, in the spring of 1941, Brazil's foreign minister Osvaldo Aranha allegedly said, "The next goodwill mission that arrives in Rio, Brazil will declare war on the United States." It was, of course, meant as a joke, but it does paint a picture. Plus, remember that labor strike that was on the way? Well, it kinda made things messy when it came to going on the tour as well. For one, it delayed the trip significantly, and some considered it in poor taste to send him over there at a time where he'd become kind of controversial. In short, Walt Disney could not have had worse timing. The trip did end up happening despite these warnings, but they did take extra care to avoid the common mistakes as much as they could, for instance by avoiding any public identification with any government agency, promising to include Latin American artists of various kinds in the project, and focusing on individual countries rather than just the Latin American vibes. This marks the beginning of Disney's trip, which would serve as the framing device for the film Saludos Amigos. It follows the Disney crew as they travel through Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, almost feeling like a documentary showing the different countries and how each one inspired the animators. The live-action segments are then accompanied by animated ones that the trip inspired. The film was relatively short, with a 42-minute runtime, and consisted of 4 segments, one for each country. The final segment, Aquarela do Brasil, or Watercolor for Brazil, being the most relevant to this topic. This segment was inspired by the trip to, funnily enough, Brazil, where the Disney animators allegedly felt inspired by the Brazilian parrots that appeared in a lot of the jokes and funny stories they heard. It's possible the inspiration for him came from the Brazilian cartoonist José Carlos, who had drawn a parrot character for an art exhibition the Disney crew had attended. After this, they all set out to do a bunch of research on parrots, photograph them, and learn about them with the intention of creating a Disney character inspired by the animal. The production of this segment was a lengthy process because of some disagreement as to what exactly the structure should be, having a lot of ideas for imagery but not so much for the plot. They ended up working around the concept of José Carioca as a character, and settled on the idea of Donald Duck visiting Rio de Janeiro. An early description of José Carioca's personality reads as follows. Papagayo is quite a comic and has a tendency to get into trouble through his own fresh remarks and actions. He's the type that will start a fight and then walk out leaving someone else to finish it. He's more carefree than Donald Duck, seldom loses his temper, and when he does, his anger would take the form of clever criticism or insult. He is quick to take advantage of any situation, an opportunist. Papagayo is very musical and romantic, which is a fairly similar description to the José we know today. They wanted the jokes in the segment to be made at the expense of Donald, the visitor from the US, rather than José, by playing with the differences between the characters. In the segment itself, we see José being created by a paintbrush, accompanied by more watercolor imagery and the song Aquarela do Brasil, which is the same name as the segment, composed by the Brazilian composer Ari Barroso. José immediately encounters Donald, excited to meet the Donald Duck, and shows him around Brazil, introducing him to the samba. Notable things about him in this segment are his go-lucky attitude, his umbrella flute, and his love of Brazilian culture. Throughout the segment, Donald refers to him as Joe Carioca, a nickname that had become common in the Disney studios at the time, where they'd used José and Joe almost interchangeably. This version of José Carioca was voiced by the Brazilian musician José do Patrocínio Oliveira, who would later also be referred to by the nickname Cê Carioca, which had become the common nickname for José Carioca in Brazil. The official world premiere of Saludos Amigos took place in Rio de Janeiro on the 24th of August 1942 under the Portuguese title Alô Amigos, and the movie was, allegedly, a huge hit. In an article from Time from January 25, 1943, before the North American premiere of the film, it stated that one audience in Rio de Janeiro screamed so loudly for an encore that another feature had to be halted in mid-reel and Saludos Amigos run off again. In addition, this article also describes José Carioca as a dapper Brazilian parrot who is as superior to Donald Duck as the duck was to Mickey Mouse, which is high hopes for a character. The film also won Best Documentary at the National Board of Review Awards of 1943, which I find really funny, actually. Now, it's worth noting that it wasn't necessarily seen as a perfect gesture everywhere. While it's nowhere near as obvious as with several other things Disney was making at the time, the film was still created in the context of war and propaganda, and I also can't confidently say whether we can fully believe the response according to Time from 1943. In Chile, there was apparently also some dissatisfaction with their country being represented by an airplane instead of there being a more in-depth look at their culture, which also led the cartoonist René Rios Borger to create his own character related to Chile called Condorito, which is just, I don't know, a bonus fact, I guess. But according to most contemporary sources, the film was popular with Latin American audiences at the time and was considered a success as a goodwill gesture. And what do you do when a movie's a success? Even before the premiere of Saludos Amigos, the positive early reactions to the film had already led the studio to begin production on a new similar project. At this point, it was simply titled South American Group No. 2, because apparently they named projects just as creatively as I do. The title is a bit misleading in the sense that from the beginning it was intended that Mexico would be involved, which is actually in the south of North America. Back during the trip, a couple of Disney animators had spent some time in Mexico City to do some research. In order to elaborate on this research, Walt Disney decided to go on yet another trip with a smaller group to visit several areas down there. Inspiration for several segments, for instance one about Las Posadas, was gathered during this trip. These trips to Mexico went on during December of 1942, along with a music-specific trip during the spring of 1943. The Three Caballeros, contrary to Saludos Amigos, ended up focusing primarily on Brazil and Mexico. They already had a character to represent Brazil, but there was a new character in the works for this movie meant to represent Mexico, which I'll come back to very soon. Now, the Three Caballeros was similar to Saludos Amigos in concept, a packaged film focusing on different countries stitched together by a framing device. But since they had the production in the works for longer and knew what it was going to become for longer, it turned out a little different. The framing device, instead of being documentary-like real-life clips, was instead about Donald Duck, the film sort of doubling as a 10-year anniversary movie for him. The plot, in brief, is that it's Donald Duck's birthday, and two friends of his have been sending him gifts for it. Each gift then initiates a different segment. The first, arguably noteworthy segment is one about rare birds, because I feel like if we're going to talk about the Three Caballeros, I have to at least mention the Aracuan. The Aracuan is introduced in this segment, characterized by his eccentric personality and his iconic song. He appears again throughout the movie doing various powerful cartoon antics, and he later also appears in the package film Melody Time, which I will come back to, The Short Clown of the Jungle, which I watched before I knew about this movie, so I initially thought that was where it was from, and makes some appearances throughout the years. We will see him in relation to the Three Caballeros again later on. Anyway, the first segments of this movie consists of pretty simple shorts, the one about Pablo the Penguin and the Flying Donkey, but the rest of the movie is important when it comes to the titular characters. After a little while, Jose Carioca shows up in an epic comeback segment about Bahia, which by modern standards looks like it's spelled wrong, but the movie was apparently produced during a whole bunch of Portuguese orthographic reform, so there was a whole thing where it went from being spelled Bahia to being spelled Bahia to Bahia again. I don't know enough about this to be certain because I didn't know where to look, so for all I know it might be entirely inaccurate information. Ask a Portuguese language expert, I just talk about cartoon birds. This segment is also where the film sort of changes in style. Jose takes Donald on a journey to the Brazilian state of Bahia. Notably, however, this segment combines cartoon and live action, a trend seen throughout the rest of the film. Bahia even stars the Brazilian singer and actress Aurora Miranda on screen, where she kisses Donald Duck, which looks even weirder than it sounds. Later in the film, we also see the Mexican singer Dora Luz and the other Mexican singer and actress Carmen Molina, all of which appear on screen next to the cartoon characters. This was really unique and obviously technically impressive for its time. The reason the movie changes in style like this is because the different parts were developed at slightly different times in the production of Saludos Amigos. The first segments of the movie began production shortly after the first trip south of the border in 1941, produced more or less like regular cartoon shorts. The development of the next segments of the movie started in mid-1942 when it was apparent that what they were producing were feature-length package films, and thus they decided something more exciting was in order. Just like in Saludos Amigos with Aquarela do Brasil, Disney had also gotten the rights to use songs from the countries they were visiting. For the Bahia segment, that was Você Já Foi a Bahia by Dorival Caymmi, and Os Quindindiaya, another banger by Ari Barroso, the composer of Aquarela do Brasil. We see Jose Carioca for a lot longer than in Saludos Amigos. For instance, it is established that he knows dark magic. He also sings, the singer José do Patrocinio Oliveira reprising his role yet again. After the Bahia segment, however, Donald opens yet another present that initiates an absolutely wild transition, which is quite a trend in this movie, you should see the ending, where we finally meet the third Caballero, Panchito Pistolas, voiced by Joaquin Garay. except not in the Mexican-Spanish dub because Garay had lived most of his life in the US, so they didn't feel like he sounded Mexican enough for that, so they instead got his voice coach, Felipe Turic, to do the speaking parts in that version, apparently. Panchito wasn't originally a part of the outline to the segment, but by mid-1943 his role in the movie was finally sealed and people were hyped for his appearance. A correspondent apparently stated, 6 months from now, más o menos, Whimsy's newest swashbuckling gallant, El Señor Gallito, is due to spring in all his radiant habiliments upon the screen-loving public from Walt Disney California Studios. I could only find one source for this quote, and it wasn't super specific, but I really liked it, so there you go. He ended up being the basis of the segment, being the one to provide exposition about Mexican culture and talk about La Piñata and Las Posadas. He also later shows them around Mexico on a so-called flying zarape. Panchito's appearance also becomes the first time we're introduced properly to the Three Caballeros as a group name. When he appears, the Mexican song Ay Jalisco no te rajes, which was featured in the famous 1941 movie by the same name, plays. Later, Panchito shouts with glee, "And now we're 3 gay caballeros," and begins to sing a modified version of the song with new lyrics, which would then become the iconic Three Caballeros song featured in a lot of their future appearances. Three caballeros. While in production, Panchito was described as the Charro Rooster. Charro generally refers to traditional Mexican horse riders, and his skills related to horses will kind of come into play in the future. He is taller than the other caballeros and has his iconic 2 pistols if his surname, Pistoles, didn't make that clear, despite how that technically should be spelled like this. Just like in the first movie, most of the jokes are at the expense of Donald, depicting him as a bit of a moron in favor of making Jose and Panchito seem more reasonable by comparison. And now we've got a fun-loving trio. They all go to a Mexican beach, are a bit creepy towards some women, they kiss each other more than you'd think, and there we go, the movie's over. What did people think this time? Well, the reviews were a bit mixed. Some people thought that the movie was incoherent, mostly focusing on being technically impressive. Let me read a passage from a book to you because I got sick of paraphrasing. Many felt keenly that the film's missing element was the old Disney staple warmth. Others recoiled from its hodgepodge structure, explosive colors, and breakneck pace, believing that it culminated only in incoherence and confusion. The movie critic for the Baltimore Sun insisted that this movie dazzles the senses, but it frequently arouses suspicions that it is never making any tangible sense. Which I do understand, because it honestly doesn't make all that much sense a lot of the time. Some people were also thrown off by the more sexual bits of the movie, where Donald chases after real human women. Overall, the movie didn't do all that well, but it was generally okay, and the songs used in it ended up taking off significantly outside of the regional fame, kind of like Acarela do Brasil did. Here's Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters performing the Three Caballeros song, for instance.
We're 3 caballeros, 3 gay caballeros.
Which is really funny considering that this is a parody of another song and that these were like actual celebrities. I feel like it's relevant to talk about the newspaper comics related to Jose and Panchito at this point. See, while Saludos Amigos premiered for the first time in Brazil in August of 1942, it didn't premiere in America until 1943, but the American public had already been partially introduced to Jose Carioca before then. On October 11th, 1942, Jose would make his first US appearance in the newspaper Sunday pages in the Silly Symphony comic strip. This comic strip was later replaced by one containing Panchito, sort of to promote the Three Caballeros. These comics were compiled in the Silly Symphonies collection, Volume 4, which I got my hands on to make this video. I have now read several of them. There were 2 main artists for the Jose comics. It started off with Bob Grant with Carl Carpe as the inker, but when he was drafted, because again this was still during wartime, Paul Murray took over. Today he is mostly famous for his work on the Mickey Mouse comics. He was assisted by Dick Morse. The comics expand on the world of Jose Carioca and the people in it. Jose lives in the city dump with his neighbors Nestor and Chuao. Most of the stories follow Jose getting caught up in increasingly ridiculous lies while trying to convince women that he is rich, so that he can get married to a rich woman. We meet 4 primary love interests throughout, and they all have the most horrific bird woman designs I've ever seen in my life. Look at this! Why would they do this? I know I made like a video complaining about the designs of women in the Duck comics, but I really need you to know that nothing else I've seen is as bad as this. This is literally a human woman with a beak, and the beak looks like it has lipstick on it. Later in these comics, on April 16th of 1944, Panchito is introduced as a rival of Jose in the pursuit of Mimi, who is really into horse riding. This was about a year before the US premiere of the Three Caballeros, and also some months before its original premiere in Mexico. This would lead to the introduction of the Panchito comics, which would replace the Jose comics on October 8th, 1944. The Panchito comics introduce a character that would later be reused, Panchito's horse, Señor Martinez. A lot of the comics are them going on little adventures together and Panchito exploring different villages. He also tries to impress women, but there's a little less lying involved. I would also quickly like to mention that all of these comics have entirely written out accents for every character, which becomes a little much down the line in my opinion. Can you please just use the letter I sometimes? So from my understanding, there were originally meant to be 3 Good Neighbor policy pictures of the same style as Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros. Plans changed over time for a variety of reasons, but because there were initially more shorts planned for this style of film, these things often ended up being used for something else or turning into something else entirely over time. A notable segment when talking about the Three Caballeros would later appear pretty much in its originally intended form in the package film Melody Time from 1948. Here we finally see Jose Carioca as well as the Aracuan bird on the big screen once more in Blame It on the Samba. In this segment we follow Jose Carioca and Donald Duck as they go from feeling tired and depressed to being blessed by the rhythm of the samba, which the Aracuan bird introduces them to. It also comes with a few surreal parts similar to those in the Three Caballeros, watching them dance alongside Ethel Smith, someone who was actually born in America but had gained some popularity elsewhere due to an interest in South American music and such. They didn't feature Panchito because the short focused on Brazil and not Mexico. Generally though, Jose has been used in more media than Panchito has. I'm assuming because he was generally speaking more popular altogether. From what I can tell, there just aren't really any animated appearances that feature Panchito and not Jose, while there's a lot the other way around. Jose also later appears in the series The Wonderful World of Disney, which changed names throughout its run. He appeared in the episodes Two Happy Amigos, Carnival Time, and Music for Everybody, all airing in the 1960s. In Two Happy Amigos, Jose visits Donald and, among other things, they visit different locations in the US through postcards. In Carnival Time, Jose is a correspondent for the Fun Drake Report, and in Music for Everybody, we also see Blame It on the Samba again. Then there was kind of a weird gap between that and the next appearance. In 1988, he made a very brief non-speaking appearance in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Also, I don't think we can call this one an animated appearance, but in the 90s on Brazilian television, he appeared as a puppet host of the Club Disney segment. I really want this puppet actually, can someone get me a Zé Carioca puppet? On October 2nd, 1999, he was featured in an episode of the series Mickey Mouse Works called Mickey Tries to Cook, where he sets up a date for Mickey and Minnie. In this one, he is voiced by Dennis Martel. Panchito finally appears again alongside him on The House of Mouse, which aired from 2001 to 2003. They appear in the crowd together a few times and notably have an episode titled The Three Caballeros. In The House of Mouse, Jose is voiced by Rob Paulsen, who among other things voiced Yakko and Pinky from Animaniacs, and Panchito is voiced by Carlos Alazraqui, who is well known for voicing Rocco on Rocco's Modern Life. They also appear in the episode Not So Goofy, where we get yet another addition to Panchito's character that comes up later. Or well, maybe not addition, put a pin in that for when we talk more about the comics, but it's his really long name. In the song My Name is Panchito, Panchito declares that his full name is Panchito Romero Miguel Junipero Francisco Cantero Gonzalez, which notably doesn't include Pistoles, so some assume it's a nickname from then on. In 2007, the Gran Fiesta Tour starring the Three Caballeros opened at Disney World, Florida in the Mexico Pavilion. Here, Rob Paulsen and Carlos Alazraqui would reprise their roles again, and we also see a Panchito and Jose animatronic. Jose appeared in the Mickey Mouse episode O Futebol Clásico on June 6th in 2014, where he was voiced by Mark LaRoya, appeared with Panchito in the episode Feliz Cumpleaños on November 18th, 2015, and again on his own in the episode Carnaval in 2018 to jump ahead a bit. Paulsen and Alazraqui would reprise their roles as the two on Mickey and the Roadster Racers in the episode Mickey's Perfecto Day. In this one, we add the third to Panchito's full name. Now that I've mentioned a puppet and a ride, they also showed up in a Disney show at Disney World Paris called Max Live, getting goofy with it in 2018 alongside Max, Yzma, Cusco, Stitch, and Angel and stuff. It's wild. I watched the whole thing on YouTube as research for this. They sing Saludos Amigos from Saludos Amigos, which is awkward considering Panchito wasn't in that one. Also the Three Caballeros song, and then they also sing along to several other Disney songs. This show doesn't even feel like it's from 2018. The trio got their own animated series in 2018 called Legend of the Three Caballeros, directed by Matt Danner. This series is interesting for a lot of reasons because it has a lot of things from the Duck comics too that you don't see in Disney animation as often. For instance, it's the first time Daisy's nieces, April, May, and June, ever had animated speaking roles. It's also interesting for the Three Caballeros because in this one they've never met before the start of the series, and meet due to shared inheritance and go on magical adventures together. We also see the Aracuan again. Look at him go. The theme song is a shorter version of the Three Caballeros song. Also, quick tangent, ever since the first appearance of the song, there's been this really funny removal of the word gay from it. In this they go three brave caballeros, sometimes they go yes three caballeros, it's a whole thing. In this, Jose is voiced by Eric Bauza, and Panchito is voiced by Jamie Camille. Also, they drop Junipero from Panchito's full name. Panchito and Jose also appear in the new DuckTales in The Town Where Everyone Was Nice in 2018, where their iconic Three Caballeros song would return yet again, in Louis 11 in 2020, as well as in the finale The Last Adventure in 2021. Aside from the Silly Symphony comic strips, Jose and Panchito both appeared in Walt Disney comics and stories. Back then, there were mostly newspaper reprints in those, but in 1942, Jose appeared in a new story titled The Carnival King. In 1943, once again before the Three Caballeros premiere altogether, Panchito appeared in his own story. This, from what I can tell, is the actual first time Panchito is depicted with a really long name, though it's different from the one mentioned in The House of Mouse. Here, Panchito says his full name is Jose Francisco Alessandro de Lima y de la Loma Pancho Alegre. If you've been paying close attention to the years, you'll notice that this seems to be the first Panchito appearance. They appeared in some Italian stories, such as in the parody of Dante's Inferno from 1949, L'Inferno di Topolino by Guido Martina and Angelo Bioletto, and in December of 1963 they got major roles in the story titled I Tre Caballeros y la Guerra dei Jukeboxes by Giampaolo Barroso and Giovan Battista Carpi. In Brazil, Jose Carioca gained a lot of popularity compared to other countries. Jose is on the cover with Donald in the first Abril o Pato Donald comic book in July of 1950, and when there was a demand for new Jose Carioca comics, Se Carioca launched as a standalone comic book in 1961. They worked with some of the same characters as in the Silly Symphony strip and created new characters like Pidao and Afonsinho. In the 1990s, they changed Jose's outfit to a more contemporary one, which is also the one he's seen in his puppet version on Brazilian television. I haven't read any of these myself because I don't speak Portuguese and they're also just a bit hard for me to get, and I've also already read so much to make this Please Leave Me Alone, but if anyone grew up with them or something, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. In the Netherlands, they've appeared in several stories after they reprinted the Sunday Pages in the 1980s and are still producing Jose and Panchito comics to this day. A particularly noteworthy story, or rather two stories featuring the Three Caballeros, are those by Don Rosa. The reason I find these noteworthy is mostly because, all things considered, their existence is kind of an outlier. Don Rosa is a comic artist who's very famous for sticking very closely to the version of the Duckverse, or whatever we could call it, loosely established by Carl Barks. Running with the idea that some people watching this haven't heard much about Carl Barks before, he's essentially known for creating Duckburg and fully establishing the world Donald Duck lives in, creating a sort of independent comic book existence for him. Don Rosa is well known for being a Carl Barks fan, but Carl Barks himself never used Panchito or Jose in any stories, so the fact that Don Rosa would make two stories about them is sort of interesting. Apparently he did it partially because he felt Donald was missing some peers he could be around that weren't unnecessarily mean to him, which is an understandable desire. I feel like I have it even more than Don Rosa because man does Don Rosa refuse to let Donald be fully happy most of the time. He created two comics featuring the trio. The first one is The Three Caballeros Ride Again from 2000. To be honest, most of this comic reads like a crossover episode. Anyway, it works with the idea that Jose, Panchito, and Donald are old friends and they encounter each other again. It includes Senor Martinez from the Panchito comics as well. At the end, there's a whole scene where the three of them sing the Three Caballeros song together like some sort of comic book music video complete with music sheets, which I think is kind of fun. If you're curious, they replace gay with three again. The second one is The Magnificent Seven minus Four Caballeros from 2005. This time we only get one panel of them singing together, unfortunately. These aren't the only comics with them, of course, and more are still being made. During the time where there were no appearances in animation, they were sometimes present in comics. I probably didn't mention every appearance of them in this video. Actually, I know I didn't. Like I just said, there are more specific comic book appearances. There's more history and more nuances hidden between the cracks, but this was a general breakdown of how this trio came to be and their overall lifespan so far. I'm sure there's a lot to be said about Jose and Panchito's impact, their somewhat controversial origins, and they're undeniably a fascinating part of Disney history, no matter how you look at them. I don't know what's next for the Three Caballeros. Them getting their own series in 2018 that started airing on TV in 2021 was a development I didn't really expect, to be honest. Their life is probably far from over, and I'd be interested to see what's done with them in the future. Also, can they say gay again? I'd like them to say gay again.